They said the dead don't speak, but in 1846, beneath the warped wooden floorboards of St. Emery's Church in Maine, 11 brides began to whisper again. The church was silent when the sheriff arrived. The townsfolk had stopped coming weeks before, not because of a scandal. No, there was no scandal. Just an unease. Like something was off, but no one could name it. The pastor still preached every Sunday to an empty pew, said the congregation was present in spirit, said the Lord had promised their return. What no one knew was that he meant it literally. They buried the first bride in secret, beneath the altar, said she died in childbirth, but she was 17, unmarried, and there was no child. By the time the fifth bride disappeared, people whispered that God had left the valley. That's when old Mrs. Halloway claimed she saw a pale woman in a veil walking barefoot through the woods behind the church, her wedding gown soaked in something dark that wasn't mud. Still, no one acted. The pastor was respected. He was called. You didn't question a man of God back then, especially one whose sermons could make grown men weep and little boys faint from fear. But when that church floor began to breathe, when the wood pulsed like lungs gasping under pressure, someone finally pried it open. They found them stacked like relics. 11 bodies in white, perfectly preserved, hands folded in prayer, eyes sewn shut with what appeared to be their own hair. One had a rosary melted into her jaw, and in the pastor's study, a leather-bound ledger, 11 names, 11 dates, 11 reasons why each was chosen. Every page ended with the same line: she will rise. They all will. When the veil thins again. This wasn't just a series of murders. This was ritual, a calculated, buried doctrine passed down under the guise of salvation. The church didn't just hide it. It needed it. And that's what we're here to uncover. Not a haunting, not folklore. A system, a blueprint, a truth buried in the name of holy obedience. That's finally clawing its way back up. Stay close, because the veil is thinning again. The church no longer stands. What remains is a hollow plot fenced off by rusted iron, half swallowed by the woods. But if you dig deep enough, if you're willing to look past the official records, you'll find something worse than bones. You'll find permission. In 1845, Reverend Silas Thorne arrived in Black Hollow, Maine. A Yale man, letters of recommendation, deep pockets, a gift for language. His sermons weren't just scripture, they were surgery. The kind that cuts into your soul and convinces you it needed the bleeding. The town called him a healer, but he wasn't sent by God. He was sent by a council, a hidden sect older than the church itself, one that believed women, pure, untouched, devoted, could serve as bridges between this world and the next. Brides not for husbands, but for the silence behind the veil. That was the real doctrine, and Black Hollow became its testing ground. Each of the 11 young women was chosen, groomed, conditioned. Their families were promised divine favor, secret fortunes, or spiritual inheritance. Whatever lie the Reverend needed, he used it. Most didn't resist. Because control doesn't always come by force. It comes wrapped in scripture, spoken softly through stained glass promises. It's agreement disguised as faith. What they called marriage was never legal. No ceremonies, no guests. Just a midnight visit to the pastor's study, a signature in the ledger, and a promise that their sacrifice would keep the darkness away from the town. Their bodies weren't buried. They were planted, positioned beneath the altar so that each Sunday when Reverend Thorne preached, he stood directly above them. Their presence was part of the ritual, their deaths necessary. The town thrived for a time. No plagues, no storms, no famine, just calm obedience. But calm is a dangerous lie when it's built on blood. One girl escaped, the 12th. She never spoke. Her tongue had been partially removed. But what she wrote on the chapel walls before vanishing was enough. The bridegroom is not a man, and he is still hungry. This isn't a ghost story. It's a blueprint, a repeatable design for religious control, hidden beneath tradition, reinforced through silence. They say what's buried stays buried. But when it's buried beneath the altar, it listens. The town records list the 11 girls as missing. No deaths, no funerals, no questions. Just vanished. One by one, over 11 consecutive months. They were all between the ages of 16 and 20, all from devout families, all obedient, polite, unmarried. Some were engaged, their weddings mysteriously canceled weeks before the date. Others had just finished school. A few were rumored to be troubled, but in every case, Reverend Thorne was the last to see them. And he always gave the same answer. She has gone to prepare her soul. No one dared challenge him. The church provided everything: food, employment, spiritual guidance. To question the Reverend was to question the system that fed your children. That's how systems of control work. They don't silence you with force. They make you dependent, grateful, afraid to look too close, because looking means losing everything. But then came the 12th girl, Evelyn Granger, 17, sharp, observant. She didn't trust Thorne, kept a diary, drew sketches of the hidden symbols etched behind the pulpit, recorded the strange dates he muttered during prayer, dates that didn't match any holy calendar. She disappeared on the night of November 12, 1846. But 2 weeks later, she returned, bloodied, half-starved, her right foot missing, found shivering at the edge of town, clutching a rolled parchment and whispering numbers that didn't make sense. She lived just long enough to tell one man, the town physician, Dr. Elias Murrow, that the other girls were below. She didn't mean underground. She meant beneath the altar, beneath the wood, beneath the sermon. Dr. Murrow broke into the church that same night, hammer in hand. When he pried open the first board, the scent hit him like rot and flowers, sweet and sour, the kind of smell that doesn't come from death alone, but from something kept unnaturally preserved. What he found destroyed him. The 11 brides placed in exact formation, circular, spiraled, mouths stitched closed, not with thread, but with braided reeds soaked in salt, each holding a slip of parchment, the same phrase written again and again. When he speaks, we listen. But who was he? Not the Reverend, and not any god you'd recognize. We're about to descend further now, and the air's about to get colder. The papers were dismissed as madness. Dr. Murrow tried to bring what he found to the county authorities. He carried with him one of the reed-stitched parchments and Evelyn's diary, but they never made it into evidence. The ledger vanished. His official report was rewritten, and within a week, Murrow was declared mentally unfit to practice. That's how it always works when forbidden knowledge surfaces. Not with trials, but with quiet erasure. Those in power don't need to silence the truth. They just need to make you sound insane for speaking it. The church went on operating for another 5 years. Services held, donations accepted. Locals came and left, believing it was still holy ground, never knowing what pulsed beneath their feet. They were standing atop a ritual site, not a church, a gate. Because this was never about murder. It was about invitation. The writings Evelyn left behind weren't just diary entries. They were coordinates, symbols, the same markings found in 13th century grimoires from Eastern Europe, diagrams from ancient desert sects in North Africa, circles that mimic the layout of crop burials from southern Wales, all drawn with near-perfect accuracy by a 17-year-old girl who had never left Maine. She wasn't hallucinating. She was translating. And what she described is where we go next. 11 brides, 11 positions, each representing a different part of the veil, the metaphorical barrier between conscious life and the unseen. Their deaths synchronized with the lunar calendar, each burial accompanied by a rite spoken in a language that doesn't appear in any modern catalog. But the Reverend knew it. He wrote it phonetically, dozens of times, in the margins of his sermons, over and over. Belnas et rachtev, me su evig. No translation exists, but every time that phrase was recited, something happened. The church lights dimmed down, the air thickened, and those who attended remembered less and less of the service as the weeks went on. It wasn't a sermon. It was a chant, a calibration, preparing the congregation not to hear truth, but to forget it. And that's the darkest kind of manipulation, not forcing belief, but erasing memory. The town of Grenton, Maine doesn't talk about the church anymore. It was torn down in 1851 under structural concerns after the roof supposedly collapsed during a winter storm. No storm was recorded, no damage photographed, and no demolition crew ever signed the papers. It was simply gone. The land was fenced off, declared unsafe, eventually reclassified as private property owned by a silent holding trust in Boston, a company with no known employees and no tax filings. But here's what matters. The floorboards were never recovered. The spiraled pattern, gone. The stitched reeds never entered into evidence. And yet, witnesses remained. People like Mary Calder, a seamstress who washed altar cloths. She remembered blood, thin and black, on the linens weeks before the disappearances began. Or Samuel Brigg, the bell ringer's son. He swore the bells rang 13 times at midnight on the first of each month, even when no one pulled the rope. They were preparing something. Not a burial, a return. Because Evelyn's final drawings weren't of brides, they were of keys, 11 symbols drawn in concentric sequence, each one activated only when placed beneath living flesh. Her final note read, "He is not coming. He is already here, buried beneath your hymns." It's the most disturbing line in the whole case, because if that's true, it means the entire town had been singing over a cage. Their worship, unknowingly, was the seal. And that changes everything. Not just about Grenton, but about every forgotten town, every fire-damaged church with no origin record, every group of missing women whose names only exist on fading paper. This wasn't an isolated event. It was a pattern. One used by those who don't just believe in ancient forces, but serve them. You think the past is dead? It isn't. It's waiting, and it's fed through memory, through obedience. Though rough ritual disguised as righteousness. The 11 brides were not victims, they were vessels, chosen not for who they were, but for what they could carry. Because some things don't enter through doors, they enter through faith. And once they're inside, they never leave. There's a reason we don't find photographs of the brides. 11 young women, all between 16 and 22, all said to be pure of bloodline, selected by Reverend Alder himself. But not a single portrait. No marriage records, no written announcements of engagement or family approval. They weren't brides in the earthly sense. They were preparations. The pastor didn't seek wives for union. He sought vessels for return. Each girl was handpicked for a role in what the church's hidden ledger called the bridal alignment, a ritual older than Christianity, one that required the body to be buried before the name was spoken. And that's what he did. One by one, the girls were summoned under the guise of counseling, prepared, isolated, then walked, barefoot, to the altar under candlelight, not for marriage, but for offering. No one saw them again, except for one man, Elias Kern, the old groundskeeper. He came forward years later with what he swore was the truth. He was 72 by then, and dying. Said he couldn't take the memory with him, that he had to confess. He claimed he saw it, the process, the white garments, the symbolic anointing, the faint hum that began as a whisper but grew to fill the chapel walls. And then, silence. Not a scream, not a struggle, just silence, followed by the sound of earth being shoveled, not outside, but within. Beneath the floorboards. When asked why he didn't stop it, Elias said only one thing: "They weren't afraid." That's how I knew it wasn't right. Not one of them was afraid. It's that line that haunts most researchers, because fear is human. But surrender? That's ritual. And whether they were drugged, conditioned, or convinced, the brides willingly laid beneath the altar. Some said their eyes stayed open. Others claimed their lips moved even after the last breath, as if reciting something, silently, into the dark. And whatever that was, whatever language they whispered, it was never meant for the living. There's a detail the town archivist never wanted cataloged. A page, torn, brittle, scorched along the edges, found tucked behind the sanctuary's cornerstone after demolition. Its ink was faint, but not gone. A mixture of Latin, Hebrew, and something older. Something not made for the human throat. At the bottom was a seal. 11 circles, one open, and the date, October 31st, 1846. The final day the brides were seen. But what terrified the archivist wasn't the content. It was the signature, A. Alder, the pastor himself, meaning he left it there on purpose. And what was written wasn't a prayer. It was a receipt. A record that the ritual had been completed, that the veins had been emptied, the threshold bound, and the passage opened for the vessel's reawakening. These weren't metaphors, they were instructions. Because the ritual didn't end with burial. It began there, and Grenton's people were participants, whether they knew it or not. Churchgoers reported phantom hymns in the weeks that followed. The organ would play itself at dusk, candles lit without flame, and once, the floorboards breathed, rising and falling like a chest taking air. That's when the town changed. Babies were born without breath, but opened their eyes days later. Cats circled the altar and refused to leave, mewling at the ground. And the new pastor, he only lasted 3 Sundays. He left a single note before vanishing. "I know what's under me, and it's listening." He was never found. But Evelyn's father, the one who first reported her missing, began showing signs of madness shortly after, whispered to himself, scratched at his throat. Then, one night, he tried to dig into the floor with his bare hands, screaming one word over and over: "She's speaking. She's speaking." They found him bleeding, nails torn, eyes wide with recognition. But when asked what he heard, all he said was, "The wedding isn't over. The veil was never lifted." It was then the town began sealing records, burning pages, paying handsomely to silence those who remembered. Because if the veil was never lifted, it means the ritual is still in progress. And the last bride was never buried. She was waiting. The final bride's name was withheld. Even in the archived ledgers, she's listed only as the 11th. No birth record, no family, no witness to her arrival or departure. But the townspeople spoke of her differently. They called her the one who waits. They said she came at night, a figure in white walking barefoot through the chapel after hours, always silent, always alone, and always carrying a single thing, a broken mirror, wrapped in cloth. Not a Bible, not a cross, just a cracked mirror, its edges blackened like it had been pulled from a fire. Some children swore she stood outside their windows, mouthing things that made no sound. Some adults woke to the scent of lilies and the shape of footprints in ash across their floors. And one girl, Anna Caldry, age 9, was found sleepwalking, barefoot, in her nightgown, standing directly over the altar's center, whispering, "The 11th hasn't closed her eyes. She's still watching." Anna never spoke again. Doctors called it a seizure. The townspeople called it the gaze, because they believed the 11th wasn't buried. She had seen too much. And the ritual required one witness to remain awake, between the veil. A sentinel. But what was she watching for? That's where the testimonies turned strange. Old diaries speak of the shaking in the pews, of sermons where Reverend Alder would suddenly freeze mid-sentence, staring at the back door of the church, eyes wide, jaw trembling, like someone had stepped inside that no one else could see. He'd then collapse, whispering, "She's near." The veil thins. These episodes increased, and each time, a new townsperson would disappear. No struggle, no noise, just gone. And in their place, always the same, a single lily placed on their doorstep, and in the soil beneath it, a shard of mirror. Those who tried to dig deeper, literally, were met with rot. The ground below Tyne, the chapel turned black, soft and wet. Some said it pulsed. The town sealed the building with iron, salt, and stone. But every year on the last night of October, a light still flickers beneath the church floor. One circle remains open, and the 11th bride has not blinked. In 1872, 26 years after the final ceremony, a stranger arrived in Grenton. He was a quiet man, gray coat, no luggage, carrying only a leather-bound book covered in wax and string. No one knew his name, but the children whispered one behind his back. The Candleman. He stayed in the old mill house near the river, abandoned since the flood of '51. Didn't speak to anyone except the church caretaker, an old crippled man named Silas Corvin, who'd once served under Pastor Alder. What they spoke of, no one ever knew. But after that first meeting, Silas was never seen in daylight again, and the Candleman began writing. Every night at 3:11 a.m., lights could be seen through the broken shutters, flickering like flame, moving like breath. Locals claimed they saw symbols carved into the frost on their windows, things that didn't look like letters, more like eyes or teeth or keys. It wasn't until the spring thaw that his purpose became clear. He'd come to unbind the 11th, and he wasn't working alone. Beneath the floorboards of the mill house, investigators later found an altar made of bone, 12 ribs, 11 human, 1 not. The wax-covered book was there too. Its pages contained a language that didn't match any known dialect, part mathematical, part choral, part insect. But in the margins, in frantic English scrawl, one phrase repeated again and again. "She is the gate. She is the gate. She is the gate." The Candleman was never arrested. He vanished during a storm the following October, the same night the church bells rang by themselves for over an hour. But here's where the pattern returns. The next morning, the floor of the church was damp. The lilies had bloomed, out of season. And 11 mirrors were shattered in homes throughout the town, all at exactly 3:11 a.m., one for each bride, except one, the final mirror, the one from the mill house, was missing. And in its absence, a hole had opened in the ground. Not wide, but deep. So deep, no torch could find the bottom. They covered it with stone and salt and prayer. But the smell remained. And every October since, at the exact moment that mirror broke, the stone vibrates. Like something below is stirring and remembering. What no one told the townspeople, what the records never dared speak aloud, was this. The 11th bride was not chosen. She was summoned. She did not arrive in Grenton. She was brought, and not from any town, not from any family, but from beneath. Pastor Alder's sermons hinted at her even before she appeared, but he never used her name because she had none. He only called her the offering made flesh, a title, not a name, a purpose, not a person. And every account agrees on one impossible detail. She did not speak. not once, not ever. But when she opened her mouth, others heard things. Screams from people long dead, the cries of infants that were never born, and worst of all, voices they recognized as their own, begging from someplace far below. There were 3 witnesses who survived her arrival. Each of them ended up writing the same line in their journals before they lost the ability to write, or speak, or even scream. She is not from where we fall. She is from where we land. Let that sink in. Because that phrase changed everything about what the church floor was hiding. This wasn't a burial site. It was a trap door, a sealed passage to something no scripture dared name, because once something is named, it can be called. And that's what the 11th bride did. She didn't want to escape. She was waiting for them to forget, so the lock could loosen, so the watchers would stop watching, so the veil could tear. And there were signs it was already happening. Cattle were born without eyes. Infants in town were born with 11 fingers, always 11. One baby was born with no mouth at all, but its mother swore it spoke to her every night. A boy named Eli Duro vanished for 6 hours, then came back covered in black clay and smiling too wide, saying only, "She showed me how the floor breathes." Doctors blamed lead poisoning. The church blamed histers. Yeah. But some remembered what the old hymns had warned. If the 11th bride ever speaks aloud, the bones below shall open wide, and sing, there was a reason they buried them beneath the church floor. Not in a graveyard, not in the forest, but there, directly beneath the altar, beneath the pulpit, beneath the place where scripture was meant to sanctify and contain. Because the brides weren't laid to rest. They were anchored, each one sealed with a symbol carved into the bones of her spine, symbols that matched markings found on stone tablets unearthed during a forgotten excavation in the Appalachian Basin, symbols older than Christ, older than Babylon, some said older than human memory itself. Pastor Alder knew this. That's why he built the church where he did, not for the town, not for the flock, but for them. See, before Grenton, Alder wasn't a pastor. He was an academic, a forgotten name in the theological department at Yale, fired in disgrace after publishing a forbidden tract called The Hollow Bride and the Coral Gate. Only one copy is said to survive. The others were burned by his own colleagues, terrified of what he'd written. He wrote of ancient vocal locks, of humanoid vessels designed to store not spirits, but songs too dangerous to be heard aloud. Songs that once sung would tear open the seams of the soul. Songs that didn't call gods, but awaken them. He believed the voice was not just a tool of worship, but a key. And the body, the right body, prepared correctly, could be tuned like an instrument. The 11 brides weren't victims. They were instruments. Each one chosen to carry a fragment of that terrible song, buried not to silence them, but to stop them from joining. Because if all 11 tones were ever sounded together, if the harmonic pattern was ever completed, the gate would not just open. It would arrive. And the 11th bride, she was the crescendo, that final chord, that closing note, that scream of ecstasy and ruin. And what Pastor Alder failed to predict, what his writings never considered, was what might happen if she learned to sing alone, because the others were buried in silence. But she was still listening. In late October of 1846, 5 days before the final sermon, the church bell began ringing by itself. It started at dusk, then again at midnight. Always, 13 times, always cold to the touch, even though no one had climbed the tower. And then there were the teeth, small ones, human, left in pews, nestled between hymnals, found in the offering plate. At first, the congregation believed animals had broken into the church, but none of the town's animals were missing. The teeth matched children. All of them still accounted for. All of them sleeping soundly. But when Reverend Harlan, the man chosen to replace Pastor Alder after his sudden disappearance, looked into the well behind the church, he found something far more disturbing than lost teeth. Water that whispered. Not in words, not in voices, but in song. A melody that seemed to move through the bones. A tune impossible to remember and impossible to forget. He described it in his journal as, like the lullaby of the womb, but sung by something that wants you to crawl back in. Harlan sealed the well the next morning, but the song didn't stop. He began to hear it in the wind, in the rustling trees, in the murmurs of his own congregation. And then, one by one, the remaining 10 brides' graves began to crack, not from the outside in, from beneath, as if something was pushing upward, not with urgency, but with rhythm, like a pulse, like breath, like sound waiting to form shape. Then came the Sunday no one remembers attending. A full congregation, a sermon no one could recall. But afterward, everyone described the same thing. They left the church, humming. A strange, mournful tune none of them knew how they'd learned. Children hummed it in their sleep. Elders wept when they heard it and could not say why. And somewhere, deep beneath the church floor, the 11th bride began to tap. Not loudly, not faint, just a single perfect beat, repeating, as if counting time, as if waiting for the cue, as if the choir was almost ready. 3 days before the church was shut down for good, Reverend Harlan vanished. No struggle, no sign of departure, no footprints in the frost. His bed was neatly made, his sermon notes untouched. But on the pulpit lay his Bible, split down the middle, its spine torn apart like cartilage, and behind it, scratched into the altar wood, "She sings in stone." That was the last entry in his journal, too, written in ink and something else, something that stained the page like dried sap, something that pulsed under candlelight. The townspeople sealed the church the next morning. Iron nails, blessed locks. They brought in a deacon from Boston, a man trained in rituals the Vatican refused to acknowledge. He performed a rite of severance, something not meant for haunting, but for containment. The church didn't resist. Not at first. But just after the 3rd circle of salt was laid, the floor beneath the altar cracked open. Not violently, quietly, like an egg splitting in the hands of something patient. And from the opening came not fire, but harmony. A hum. Ancient. Wrong. Witnesses said it made their stomachs churn, not from fear, but from recognition. Like something buried in their blood was waking up, like the song already lived inside them. The deacon fell silent, mid-prayer, then dropped dead, eyes wide, lips curled, not in fear, but in awe. They buried him outside town, upside down, a tradition reserved for the voice-touched, those who'd heard the forbidden tune and failed to forget. That night, Grenton's skies turned the color of blood thinned with milk. The well behind the church boiled dry, and beneath the floorboards, the tapping stopped. Not because she'd ceased, but because she was listening. Because now, the town had answered. They'd heard the first note. They'd buried the priest. They'd tasted the song and survived. And somewhere in the roots of that sanctuary, wrapped in bone and silk and iron lace, the 11th bride opened her mouth, not to scream, not to speak, but to echo. After the echo came silence. Not the kind that follows death, but the kind that makes the living forget how to speak. A hush that pressed into the skin, that filled the ears, that made even thought feel blasphemous. In that silence, the town of Grenton changed. Doors once painted white began peeling in black. Mirrors clouded over, not with steam, but with breath. Children stared into corners and wept when pulled away. And down by the river, 7 townspeople walked in, fully clothed, silent, smiling. They were found 2 days later, 20 miles downstream, naked, unmarked, each with a hymnal page pressed to their chest, written in blood, ink, and something that glowed briefly in the moonlight, before turning to soot. It was then that the town's elders did something desperate. They returned to the sealed church, not to destroy it, but to listen. Old men, widows, former clergy, people who remembered Alder's voice, who had buried their daughters in wedding gowns. They stood before the cracked door, and they hummed. The tune was soft at first, unsure, a lullaby dragged up from memory or dream. But as they sang, the wind around them died. The trees stilled. The air thickened. And from beneath the church floor, she hummed back. Not one voice, but 11, layered, dissonant, beautiful. A funeral choir stitched from centuries of silence, each note sharp as a needle, warm as breath, a sound that didn't enter through the ears, but through the spine. And in that harmony, the town bent. Not broke, not shattered, bent, like iron beneath heat, like knees before a throne. Men walked home and burned their family portraits. Women unearthed wedding gowns they'd sworn never to wear. Children painted eyes on the insides of closets. Something had shifted. The town was no longer haunted. It was claimed. And deep in the earth, beneath the altar split by time and fire, the eleventh bride began to sow, threading a veil of shadow between the waking and the weeping, preparing, stitch by stitch. For the ceremony, Grenton was no longer marked by what had happened, but by what was coming. A thin mist began to rise each morning, not from dew, not from fog, but from the soil itself. It smelled faintly of myrrh and wedding cake. Those who breathed it too deeply said they could taste vanilla and ash. The pastor's house, once boarded up, now had lights flickering behind the curtains. No one lit them, no one admitted entry. But every night at 3:15, exactly, the upstairs window bled soft gold, like a candle burning behind lace. Then the dreams started. Women across town, some married, some widowed, some far too young, began waking with dried blood beneath their fingernails. Each of them dreamed the same thing. A staircase beneath the church, a dress of ivory velvet suspended in the air, a voice whispering, "One of us is missing." They couldn't remember the voice itself, only the grief behind it, as if someone had been waiting to be chosen and wasn't. The town physician recorded 37 such accounts in a single week, and then he too stopped speaking, simply began walking the same path around the graveyard each night, 7 clockwise turns, always stopping at the empty plot by the blackthorn tree. Locals said the grass never grew there, even before the church was built. But one morning, a single object appeared in that plot, a ring box, open, empty. The inscription inside read, "She was always promised." After that, no one visited the church, not even to look. It wasn't fear anymore. It was respect, like standing before a throne carved of bone, like facing a mother who had lost all 11 children and still waited for the 12th. Because somewhere, above or below, everyone felt it. The 11th bride was preparing the aisle, and the town was holding its breath. The record was filed on January 3rd, 1847. Sealed in a town ledger beneath layers of misfiled baptismal entries and fake birth certificates. Only one page, no signature, no official stamp. But the handwriting matched that of Pastor Alder, and the title at the top read, "Account of the Unfinished Sacrament." It detailed 11 ceremonies, 11 brides, 11 departures into the cellar. But one entry stood out. Bride number 12, Marion Elspeth Vere. A name no one in town remembered. No family ties, no obituary, no burial. Only a date, October 31st, 1846. A time, midnight, and a note beside her name. Body unprepared, veil incomplete, soul unrested, bride never received. The phrase, bride never received, appeared nowhere else in the ledger. No corrections, no footnotes, just those 3 words, and a red line drawn through her name. But here's where it gets worse. Next to that crossed-out name, Alder had written in smaller script, "The ceremony proceeds regardless. She will return, when ready." And beneath that, "The others will wait beneath." It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even regret. It was a schedule. Someone had once joked that Alder kept time like a conductor preparing a finale. But now, looking at his handwriting, it wasn't a joke at all. He had orchestrated something, a ritual, a binding, a clock wound tight in ritual blood and bridal silk, set to chime when the veil was mended, and all signs pointed to that veil being finished soon. Because witnesses began reporting strange patterns near the church again. A dead owl nailed to the front gate, eyes replaced with wedding pearls. A woman found standing barefoot in the snow, whispering vows to an unseen groom. A letter delivered to an address that hadn't existed in over 50 years, containing only a pressed rose and a single sentence. The bride arrives late, but never unclaimed. Done. I buried that ledger, burned the church blueprints, told the children it was just a haunted story. But the women still dreamed. And now, some of them remembered her name. They say the body forgets. That muscle memory fades. That trauma dissolves. That dreams aren't real unless you make them real. But then explain this. 3 generations later, the great-granddaughter of one of Grenton's original midwives began speaking in her sleep. Not groaning, not murmuring, but speaking, clearly, repeatedly, in perfect 1840s bridal Latin. She was 8 years old. Her parents didn't recognize the language, but an elderly teacher, once a nun, did. She translated the phrases and wept. The child was repeating the original vows used in the church's secret wedding rites, vows that were never meant to be heard by the living. When asked who taught her the words, the child responded simply, "The bride who's still waiting." It didn't stop there. At the Grenton Public Library, wedding announcements from the mid-1800s began vanishing, entire pages cut out, despite no public access. A locked drawer found open, containing only a cracked photograph. No date, no location. Just a figure in a bridal gown standing beneath a crooked arch of bones. Her face was obscured by a veil, but her hand reached outward. And in that hand, a second veil, unworn, waiting. The librarian, who had been cataloging the archive that day, resigned. Claimed she heard music coming from the ink. Claimed the photograph hummed when touched. Claimed she saw something behind the bride. Not a groom, not a minister, but 11 women, backs turned, heads bowed, standing in rows beneath the church floor, waiting to be turned around. Waiting for the 12th. After that, town authorities removed all access to the lower levels of the church, cemented the cellar shut, planted fresh grass, called it a historical reset. But the flowers planted over the site, no matter the season, turned white. Every time. And every May, just as dusk sets in, one of them goes missing. Stem broken. He had gone, as if picked or claimed. And always, always, the petals that remain are arranged into a single word. Soon. In 1958, nearly a century after the last recorded bride, A team of historical preservationists petitioned to excavate beneath the Church of St. Elias. Their purpose? To locate a rumored subterranean ossuary mentioned in two rare parish documents, believed to hold the remains of plague victims from 1799. The town council agreed, on one condition: do not breach the stone slab beneath the altar. They signed the waiver. They brought their tools, and on the morning of August 12th, they began digging. By dusk, the crew had unearthed not plague bones, but something else entirely. A row of shallow cavities carved into the floor beneath the chapel. 11 of them, each exactly 5 feet long, each lined with dried black petals and traces of woven fabric. Each cavity empty. But worse, they found remnants of lace. Lace that had not yellowed with age. Lace that hadn't decayed. Lace that looked as if it had been laid there yesterday. A crew member, Peter Wallace, took a piece home as a souvenir. Within 48 hours, he was admitted to a psychiatric facility after reportedly trying to sew his own skin into a veil. He told nurses he was getting ready. They found his journal. Its final entry read, "The altar waits. I must lie still. She needs a willing 12th." Authorities shut down the excavation immediately. No photos were released to the public. But one image, leaked decades later, shows the slab under the altar had already been disturbed. Just slightly, enough to reveal a stair, a narrow one, descending in a tight spiral, cut from stone that didn't match any in Maine or even the Americas. No one spoke about it again. No official record survives. But old gravediggers from Grenton, men who buried countless bodies in their time, spoke of something odd in hushed tones. They said the earth beneath the altar was warm, even in December, even in snow, like something was breathing. There was a man who lived on the hill behind the church. Name lost, house gone. But the town records remember his occupation: bellkeeper. He was responsible for sounding the church bell each Sunday, and on the nights when marriages were performed. But in 1846, just after the final bride was buried, he did something strange. He removed the clapper from the bell. No sound, no toll, just silence. Heavy, deliberate, unnatural. When questioned, he simply replied, "No bride should be summoned again." The church elders threatened dismissal. But the bellkeeper remained. He refused to ring it. He refused to watch the altar. And over time, his health changed. He began to speak with two voices, one high and soft, one deep and foreign. Neighbors said it sounded like a woman in sorrow arguing with something buried. Eventually, he sealed himself inside the bell tower, boarded the windows, barred the door, and left behind one final note, found years later beneath the loose floorboards. It read, "I saw the 12th. She doesn't walk. She crawls. Her dress drags the dead with it. Do not open the church on All Saints' Day. Do not ring the bell again." But the church did open, and the bell, silent for years, rang on its own. 3 times, slow, dragging, each toll sounding like a name being buried. That night, 3 townspeople vanished: a librarian, a midwife's son, and the gravedigger's daughter. None were ever found, but their names were later discovered etched into the underside of the altar slab, in bone. And those who read the carvings described one final, smaller word, etched deeper than the rest: bridesmaid, a role, a fate, a warning. Because not every woman in white is a bride. Some are chosen to watch, to wait, to weep beneath the floor, and some to bring the veil forward. In 1971, a new priest arrived in Grenton, Father Aldrich Hemsworth, young, educated, unafraid of ghosts. He was sent to revive the dwindling congregation, reignite faith, and, most importantly, modernize the parish. The Church of St. Elias had long been neglected. Cobwebs in the pews, cracks in the walls. A place more feared than loved. Father Hemsworth thought it all superstition. He reopened the church for regular Mass. He blessed the altar, and, against all warnings, he rang the bell. A reporter from the Maine Ecclesiastical Review documented his efforts. In the article, Hemsworth is quoted, "There are no brides beneath my church. Only stories, rot, and shadows." The day the article was published, 2 parishioners, sisters aged 11 and 13, vanished on their walk home from confession. No footprints, no witnesses, just 2 white ribbons found at the chapel door. Still, Father Hemsworth refused to relent. He gave sermons. He led choir rehearsals. He stayed the nights alone, sleeping in the bell tower, just like the old keeper. But one evening in late autumn, he was seen stumbling through the cemetery barefoot, clutching something, a veil, singed at the edges, wet with something dark. He kept screaming the same 3 words, "She's not gone, she's not gone, she's not gone." They found him hours later, curled up beside the altar, mouth full of earth, hands folded like a groom. He was hospitalized, never spoke again. He died 13 months later on the same date the church had first buried its brides. His autopsy revealed something disturbing. Underneath his tongue, etched into the soft tissue, was a faint burn mark in the shape of a ring. Not just a circle, a braided ring, like something woven from hair. DNA testing, decades later, confirmed the hair did not belong to Hemsworth. It didn't belong to anyone alive. It matched the grave of the first bride, buried in 1846. Which brings us to the question they buried every time someone asked what vows were made that day, and who's still keeping them. They finally sealed the church in 1974. Not because of what Father Hemsworth did, but because of what came after. The floor began to change. It moved. The stone beneath the altar cracked open, not from pressure, but from beneath. Masons called it impossible. Geologists called it unnatural. But the townspeople knew what it was. The brides had begun to shift. For months, the sacristy filled with an odor like old flowers and wet lace, like something preparing itself, like something being dressed. And then came the sound. Not a voice, not music. Something between a sob and a lullaby. Recorded once by a technician sent to inspect the old organ. He captured 13 seconds of the sound before the tape melted in the recorder. 13 seconds. One for each bride. And one that didn't sound human. When played backward, experts found a pattern. Not words, but breath. Breath in 3 rhythms. One short, one long, one stop. Midwives in Grenton recognized the pattern instantly. It was the rhythm of stillborn delivery. The priest's notes, found later behind the pulpit, confirmed a rumor long denied. Not all the brides had come alone to the altar. Some had arrived, already carrying life. And what was taken from them was not just vows, but bloodlines. Which is why, in the months before the church was sealed, local children began to report dreams. They all described the same image. A staircase under the church floor, covered in lace, leading downward, endlessly downward. And waiting at the bottom, a woman holding a lantern made from bone. She spoke one phrase, "I do." But in their dreams, the words echoed in 3 voices, and none of them sounded like hers. For nearly 40 years, the Church of St. Elias remained sealed, padlocked, boarded, shunned. Locals crossed themselves when passing. Children dared each other to touch its doors. But then, in 2012, everything changed. A Maine-based historical restoration group, Heritage Sanctuary, petitioned to preserve the building. They cited its rare mid-19th century Gothic revival features. They wanted to turn it into a community heritage museum. The town council, tired of the rumors, agreed. It was just wood and stone, after all. Nothing lives in walls, right? The restoration began in October. Contractors removed rotted pews, replaced windows, restored stained glass. But when they started digging beneath the altar to repair the cracked stone, they found something that stopped all work. A chamber, roughly 10 feet wide, lined with limestone and river rock, and in its center, 13 long, shallow trenches. Hand-dug, stacked with the remains of what they called ritually prepared female corpses, each dressed in a bridal gown, each missing their right hand, each bearing a sewn-shut mouth. The official report never mentioned the rings. But every gravedigger told the same story in whispers. The soil was filled with braided rings made of hair, human hair, woven into circles, and each one bore a small etching of a number, 1, 2, 3, up to 13, and an empty 14th ring, unmarked, newer, untouched by rot. It hadn't been buried with the others. It was found resting gently atop the altar, as if waiting. The site was quietly closed. Heritage Sanctuary vanished from the town. No final report, no media coverage, just a note left taped to the church doors, typed in all caps. Consecrated ground is not yours to undo. It was signed with 3 names, all women, none traceable. But in the town's oldest baptismal records, those names appear together once, Real, 1846. The first 3 brides married under Pastor Elam, the ones who never returned to their families, the ones said to have spoken the vow, twice. People think evil announces itself. They think it arrives with thunder, with blood, with screaming. But in Grenton, it came wrapped in white, and it whispered. For the remaining elders of the town, those who still remember the strange years between 1846 and 1853, there's a silence they will not break, not because they forgot, but because they remember too much. There are old letters hidden in attic trunks and backroom drawers, correspondence between mothers and daughters, prayers scratched into the backs of hymnals, all bearing the same phrase repeated again and again. She walked down the aisle alone, but she didn't walk back. It wasn't just the brides. It was the girls who might have become brides, girls of marrying age who began speaking in their sleep, singing hymns that hadn't been taught, and whispering answers to questions no one asked. One girl, age 14, recited a passage from the Book of Tobit in Aramaic. She had never heard of it, and yet she knew the words for binding, burial, return. Parents began sending their daughters away, to Boston, to Vermont, anywhere but Grenton, anywhere but the church. And that's when the second tragedy struck. The men of the town, the husbands, the fathers, began to disappear. They weren't murdered. They weren't taken. They walked willingly into the church and never walked out. No struggle, no blood, just coats left folded at the doors, shoes lined neatly in the narthex. Some left notes, others didn't. But one message, found carved into the inside of the confessional door, remains. I gave her to God. Now he wants me too. Whatever happened beneath that church, whatever called the brides into silence, did not stop when they were buried. It echoed. And for a time, the town itself became part of the ritual. A vessel, a vow, a mouth that could never close. And those who still live there say the ground has never gone quiet. Especially in April, especially at night, when the air smells faintly of lilies and something beneath the church floor exhales. They reopened the graves in 2013, not by choice, not officially, but because someone trespassed. Two college students from Bangor, urban explorers filming abandoned churches, snuck into St. Elias one November evening. They live-streamed the entire thing for exactly 11 minutes and 34 seconds. Then their feed cut. The footage went viral. But what people saw wasn't what they expected. No ghosts, no screams, just a slow pan of the altar, thick candle wax puddled at its base, and what looked like fresh footprints across the dust-covered floor. Bare feet, wet, leading from the altar to the chamber door. When local authorities arrived the next morning, the students were gone. So was the footage, scrubbed from every platform, DMCA takedowns, account deletions. Only fragments remain, low-resolution screenshots passed around in private forums. In one, the camera catches something most viewers miss: a single bridal veil folded neatly on the pew, still damp. Since then, St. Elias has been sealed once more, but not with padlocks. It's bricked, windowless, surrounded by a 7-foot wrought iron fence with no gate. And if you drive by on the third Sunday of any month, you'll see something strange through the cracks in the stonework. Candlelight. Moving, not flickering, pacing, as if someone, or something, walks the length of that altar, waiting, repeating. Locals no longer say the name of the church aloud. Some believe saying it invites a visit, a knock at the door, a whisper through the vent. A veil left on the porch, and then the final invitation. A letter, no address, no postage, just one word on the envelope: return. Those who receive it don't speak of it. They vanish within a year. All but one. She burned hers in front of her house while neighbors watched. She said nothing, just wept. But someone swears they saw her again, 2 nights later, walking alone toward the church. Veil in hand, mouth sewn shut. There's a reason the story never left Grenton. Not because it was hidden, but because it was preserved, like a warning etched into the bones of the town. Not in books, not in records, but in rituals. Each spring they hold no weddings, no bells are rung, no white is worn. They say the church claimed enough brides and still listens for more. The structure remains untouched, no demolition, no sale. Not because no one wants it, but because someone still does. And each year, in the first thaw of April, a veil appears near the threshold, always the same. Silk, old as ash, smelling faintly of soil and myrrh. No one dares touch it. One year a man tried. He laughed, said it was just an old rag. He picked it up, and for 17 days, no one saw him again. When they did, he was sitting in the back pew, staring at the altar, mouth full of black petals, eyes sewn open. He never spoke another word. His family moved away. The house was razed, but the veil still returns every year. And beneath the floor of St. Elias, those 11 graves still wait. Not empty, not at rest. The town knows better than to speak of what lies below. But late at night, when the wind bends just right, a sound echoes up from the sealed floorboards, a humming, soft, female, and always the same melody, the one sung on wedding days, the one meant for walking down the aisle and never walking back. So if you ever pass through Grenton and you hear it, don't stop. Don't look at the church, and whatever you do, don't follow the song, because it isn't calling to you. It's calling through you, for someone else, someone it almost had, someone who still wears white, someone whose name is still written in the walls. And if you listen long enough, you'll hear yours added to the hymn. The oldest resident of Grenton never speaks of the church directly. Not to visitors, not to family, not even to God. But she keeps 11 candles burning, every night, in a row, on her windowsill facing St. Elias. She claims nothing aloud, but her silence carries weight, like a wall holding back the sea. Her name is Martha Bell. She's 93. And she was the last girl scheduled to marry in that church before the ceiling collapsed in 1846. She never married, never left, never changed her name. She still lives in the house where she was raised, and every year on the anniversary of the fire, she places 11 lengths of white lace on her front steps. Not 12, not 10. 11. One for each bride buried beneath the floor, except she wasn't one of them. She escaped it, or so she claims. But something in her eyes says otherwise, as though part of her did marry that day, and part of her never came home. Neighbors speak in hushed tones of how she never ages beyond a certain point, how her shadow sometimes faces the wrong way, and how at dusk her home echoes with quiet weeping, though she lives alone. She's been seen speaking to figures no one else sees, not screaming, not crying, just answering, like she's being asked something. One child once dared to knock on her door. She answered slowly and smiled. Her teeth were perfect, too perfect, as if they'd never bitten anything human. She gave the child a veil, old, ivory, fragrant with rose oil and burned wax. The boy's mother burned it. That night, the candles on Martha's sill went out. Everyone. And the next day, the boy was gone. No footprints, no struggle. Only a wedding shoe in the field behind their home. Size, too small for a child. Style, too old for this century. Martha said nothing. She simply lit her candles again. And this time, she lit 12. The church isn't listed on any modern registry. No postal code, no service records, not even on the diocesan maps. But it still stands. Deep in the Maine woods. Unclaimed, unspoken, but somehow preserved. Locals claim the snow never settles on its roof, rain never touches the stone, and no birds ever perch on its spire, as if even the elements avoid it. Yet those who pass by, hunters, drifters, hikers, say the wind changes near the clearing, turns warm, smells like lilies and myrrh, and carries music, faint, feminine, and off-key. The doors are sealed, but some say they've heard laughter inside, not joyful, not childlike, but slow, rehearsed, like a choir trying to remember how to feel. There's no record of who keeps the grounds. No one admits to trimming the grass or sweeping the stone path that leads to the front steps. But it's always clear, always immaculate. Some nights, passers-by say they see candlelight flickering behind the old stained glass. Not electric, not modern. Candlelight. And 11 silhouettes. Always 11. Women, still in gowns, not moving but not quite still either, as if waiting for something to return, or someone. No vandal has ever succeeded in damaging it. Spray paint fades overnight, chainsaw blades break, and every camera pointed at it malfunctions. Once a man from Boston tried to buy the land, wanted to convert it to a museum. The deed vanished before it could be signed. Then he vanished too. Only his boots were found, arranged in front of the altar. Inside them, a single bridal ring, gold, inscribed with the words, "I return as promised," in a script no jeweler could identify. The land now lies in a legal limbo. No ownership, no taxation, no boundary. But every winter solstice, a girl disappears in the region. No link, no connection, except one. Each was last seen near St. Elias. Each was wearing white, and but had once, at some point in her life, stood at the edge of that forest and whispered, "I want to know the truth." A letter was discovered in 1987, sealed behind a loose brick in the church's crumbling rear wall. It was wrapped in lace, the same kind Martha Bell lays on her steps, still fragrant despite the years. The handwriting was elegant but shaking, as though the writer's hand wasn't fully her own. The letter began, "If you find this, don't open the floor." And then, below it, "He lied to us, all of us. We thought we were brides of Christ." But something else came down the aisle. The rest of the letter was erratic. Unfinished sentences, names scratched out, symbols not seen in any known catechism. But certain lines stood out. "The veils are not for modesty. They are to hide the marks. He married us to something older than God. I heard the choir scream in Latin, but backwards. And one final warning. They don't sleep under the floor. They listen. We are not buried. We are kept." The letter was signed by Sister Miriam of the 11. There is no record of such a nun, no convent registration, no burial certificate. But in the altar's foundation, when archaeologists quietly excavated a portion in 1992, they found 11 niches, too narrow for coffins, too deep for bodies, but each contained lace, hair, and jawbones, all from women aged 17 to 24, all with bite marks inside the jaw. From the inside, as if they'd bitten themselves to stay quiet, or to stop something else from speaking through them. The findings were sealed, the records buried, and the lead investigator, Father James Holcroft, retired without a word. A year later, he was found in his home, surrounded by 12 bridal dolls, hand-sewn, mouths stitched shut. Each wore a veil soaked in red wax. Each had a note pinned to its chest. "You brought me back. I waited." He had carved his own tongue out. It was found beneath the 12th doll. That doll had a ring with the words, "Now I speak." It was in 2003 when a theology student, Erin Rell, attempted her dissertation on forgotten Marian sects in New England. She visited the region, interviewed locals, mapped cemeteries, and then she vanished for 3 days. When she returned, she was barefoot, clothes shredded, mouth blistered as though from biting through roses. But she remembered nothing. Except one thing. She'd written a single phrase over and over in her journal. "Brides do not rest. They wait in the hymns." Her handwriting, not her own. Each line in a different script. Some too old to recognize. She dropped out, moved west. But every year on the same night, March 3rd, she receives a package, always from a different address. Inside, a pressed white veil, a candle, and a note. No words, just a hand-drawn map, always pointing back to St. Elias. Authorities have never been able to stop the packages. When intercepted, they vanish from evidence. One burned itself from the inside out, without flame. Erin, now 44, refuses interviews. Lives under a different name. But she's been seen in small towns, standing at churches, listening, eyes closed, mouthing something. Rhythmic, choral, silent. One night, a motel clerk heard her speak. Just one sentence. He quit the next morning, but told a local priest before he left. He said she whispered, "We didn't marry him. We married what wore him." In 2019, a new road construction near the church unearthed human remains. 11 again. But these ones were far older, pre-colonial. Each with their jaws cracked open at the hinge, and remnants of bridal lace woven into the bones. The pattern matched no known European textile, but perfectly matched the ones Martha Bell still lays out, on the steps of a church no one owns, in a town that won't speak its name, where 11 women once disappeared beneath the floorboards and never truly left. Some say they walk again, not in flesh, but in memory, in songs, in silence, in the mouths of those who go looking for answers, because the truth was never buried. It was bound. And now, it sings, they never found the pastor's grave. No headstone, no records, no date of death, just a chair in the vestry, still warm when they opened the sealed room decades later. The cushion had the imprint of a man who hadn't sat in 100 years, and a wedding ring, still wet with candle wax. Beneath it, a single note. She said yes, no signature, but written in red, and on parchment too old to exist. In the church's bell tower, the clapper was removed long ago. No one remembers why. Yet every year on the same night, March 3rd, at precisely 3:17 a.m., residents report hearing a bell. 3 slow tolls, followed by 11 soft knocks. No one's ever seen who does it. No one dares climb those stairs anymore. The final townsfolk who tried in 1976 were found kneeling in a circle at the top, veils over their heads, eyes removed cleanly, smiles carved into their cheeks. Each held a candle, the same type Martha Bell still places on the steps of a church that refuses to decay. Rain doesn't stain it. Wind doesn't weather it. Time doesn't claim it. Because it isn't just a building. It's a promise, a vow, a contract made not in love, but in blood, bone, and submission. The 11 brides were never victims. They were offerings, chosen, not for their purity, but for their voices. Voices trained in hymns, soft, melodic, deceiving. Because the ritual wasn't to praise God. It was to call back something else. And now it waits, not beneath the floorboards, but in the songs children hum without knowing why, in the rhythm of footsteps down long church aisles. In every wedding veil that flutters in windless air, it waits for names to be spoken, for stories to be remembered, and for the final bride to answer. One veil still remains, in the pastor's locked drawer, monogrammed not with a name, but with a number. So if you ever pass by a church with no parish, no priest, and lace laid out for no one, keep walking. Don't look inside, because the last wedding hasn't happened yet, and they've already picked the bride. It just might be the one who listens.